Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're so glad to have so many people from all across the country represented to this. Now we're going to throw it over to Tom, who's going to talk about getting into the weeds on this very exciting model of campaign finance reform.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. I'll do a quick intro for myself, and then I'll share my screen. Many of you may have met me at the last working group, but if you weren't here, my name's Tom Latkowski. I'm a policy organizer for DPEN. I wrote our policy kit on democracy vouchers and recently a book on democracy vouchers as well, which you can pick up at democracyvouchers.org if you'd like a copy. I'm also the co-founder of LA for Democracy Vouchers with Mike Draskovich, who's also on the call. So in addition to the policy role, I have an advocacy role too. So if any of you are in California or Los Angeles, please reach out. I'm sure we'll put my email in follow-ups afterwards, but you can reach me at tom@lademocracyvouchers.org. So particularly if you're in LA or California, I would love to talk. So let me share my screen now. And again, this is going to be more of a nuts and bolts dive into democracy dollars, how it works in Seattle, what the results have been, funding sources, answering many of the questions that folks submitted beforehand today. So if you were at the first working group, some of the information might repeat, but we're going to go more in depth. And this could also potentially be helpful for how to talk about democracy dollars. A quick note on naming. Of course, Seattle's program is democracy vouchers. It's the same thing. We're just calling it democracy dollars because we're experimenting to see what works better. So diving in, I'm going to cover the policy elements of democracy dollars. And these are based on questions that folks submitted beforehand. I'm going to go deep into program cost and how to think about managing the cost of the program and potential funding sources. I'll talk you through the results in Seattle and all the good news happening there. I'll go into current efforts and past efforts and what we can learn from them. And then a final thing on messaging and how to talk about democracy dollars. So first of all, just the nuts and bolts of the program. Every registered voter in Seattle gets 4 $25 vouchers each election cycle. So that's every 2 years. Every legal resident can actually use democracy vouchers, but every registered voter gets them automatically. If you're a legal resident, the city doesn't have your address on file necessarily, so you can just submit a form and get your vouchers. Folks turn them in through a prepaid envelope that you get in the mail, or by getting them directly to a campaign, or now submitting them through an online portal. And then the city verifies them and mails out checks to campaigns. So it's fairly straightforward, but I think it's important sometimes to emphasize just the logistics of it, because just saying, giving folks money to donate to campaigns, it doesn't necessarily capture what goes into it. So for candidates, it's really important to emphasize that democracy vouchers is an optional program. This is true of all public financing programs in the United States, whether it's matching funds or lump sum grants, things that other cities and states do. And that's a requirement from the Supreme Court. So we can't pass programs, at least right now with our current Supreme Court, we can't require candidates to participate in public financing programs. So that means that candidates always have the option of running under the old system if they want to. Now, what that means is that we can place extra rules on candidates who want to participate in the democracy vouchers program. So the two things you have to do to participate in Seattle, first you have to qualify, and then you have to formally opt in with the city, which means signing on to some extra rules. So qualifying, this just describes the process in Seattle. Essentially, candidates need to collect private contributions of $10 or more, and you have different numbers for the different positions. So it's designed to demonstrate that you have sufficient public support to be a serious candidate. In Seattle and Washington, there's been an issue in the past with perennial candidates who don't really have a ton of support, but always run and try and get attention. And folks didn't necessarily want democracy vouchers going to them unless they could actually demonstrate public support. So you have a small number of private contributions that you have to collect before you can start redeeming vouchers. Real quick, this just goes over the timeline as well. This is a graphic from the city of the 2021 election cycle. So you can see building up to the August primary and the November election, all the way back in January of the year before. So almost 2 years in advance of the election. You can start collecting qualifying contributions as a candidate. You can pledge to the program in July, so about a year and a half in advance of the election. So the idea is that a candidate who has public support will have plenty of time to be able to qualify and then to raise enough democracy vouchers to fund their campaigns. So the second half, to start redeeming vouchers, the first half is qualification. The second half is formally opting into the program. And this is really important. And I think it's kind of the hidden feature of democracy vouchers, democracy dollars programs, and of public financing in general. We want to have better campaigns. We don't just want vouchers to be a small supplement to a race that has all the same problems that privately financed races have. And so what we do is we get voucher candidates to agree to extra rules when they sign on to the program. And these extra rules are things that normally we couldn't impose on all candidates, right? You can see here, there are things like decreasing contribution limits, requiring attendance at public debates, putting overall spending caps on voucher campaigns. Those are things that normally would be unconstitutional to impose on candidates for public office. But because this is an optional program, courts have repeatedly ruled that you can impose these requirements, that it is constitutional, because candidates have the option, if they don't like this, to just run under the old system. And so again, in Seattle, for city council candidates, at least, there are decreased contribution limits, private contribution limits. So voucher candidates can still raise some private money. The thinking was that, to ensure that candidates think it's a strategic choice to opt into the voucher program, you don't necessarily want to cut off all access to private money for participating candidates. And so the compromise that was reached was decreasing the private contribution limits. As I said, candidates are required to attend 6 public debates, 3 in the primary and 3 in the general. And so this gets rid of the problem in some state and local races where there are candidates who feel very safe and just choose not to attend the public debate. If they're going to use democracy vouchers or democracy dollars, they have to. They're required to attend to be part of the program. And the final extra rule is spending caps for voucher campaigns. And I'll delve more into this in a moment when I talk about cost. But I do just want to emphasize that spending caps are not necessarily permanent, at least in Seattle's design of the program. The thinking again was we want political strategists, right, who are deciding what's the best choice for my candidate to get elected. We don't necessarily have the public interest as their top priority. Their top priority is just winning the race. We want them to decide that democracy dollars is a smart program for their candidate to be part of. And so in that interest, spending caps can be released if you face a privately financed opponent or if you face substantial amounts of independent expenditures. And so in this case, you can basically get out of the spending cap on your campaign. You can't raise more vouchers, but you can go back to raising private money. So this is just kind of a stopgap to make sure that the program isn't really impairing candidates who are faced with a lot of private money against them. So as I said, I want to dive into program costs here. One question that comes up sometimes when talking about democracy dollars is if we're giving every voter $100, shouldn't that just cost $100 times the population? And the answer is no, it's dramatically cheaper than that. So for example, in Seattle, the program costs about $3 million a year. And the population of Seattle is 750,000 people. So the program is dramatically cheaper than this math. There are 2 main reasons for that. And the overarching picture is that our goal is not with democracy dollars to help candidates set fundraising records, right? We're not trying to set all-time highs here. We're just trying to ensure that grassroots candidates with public support can raise enough money to fund a competitive campaign. And so first of all, campaigns face spending caps, as I said. That ensures that their campaigns can be fully funded without costing the city too much money. So the idea is, democracy dollars candidates won't always have more money than their opponents. And when I get into the results in Seattle in a little bit, I'll go into some of these cases where candidates running with democracy vouchers had less money and actually won their race because they still had enough money to get their message out. right? So with these spending caps, we can ensure that there's reasonable use of public funds and that the cost of the program doesn't just balloon. We don't have candidates raising $100 million in democracy vouchers. That won't happen because there are spending caps in place for candidates who use the program. And then the second thing, kind of as a final stopgap, the city of Seattle announces a total limit on the amount of public funds they're willing to spend in each election cycle. So I think in 2021, they announced beforehand they would spend $6.8 million, right? So that comes from the money they raised in 2020 and 2021, which again was $3 million per year. And then I believe they had a little bit left over from previous cycles. And so they said, if we hit this $6.8 million number, then worst case scenario, all candidates are released from program rules and we just go back to the old system, right? So in that case, you couldn't use democracy vouchers anymore. So what I like to tell people is the worst case scenario is that the program hits its cap and we just go back to the way things were before. The worst case scenario is just the status quo system. And so between these two things, this is how you ensure that the program doesn't balloon in cost, right? So it's really important to include spending caps on candidates and overall caps on the use of public money. That's how you refute this argument that it's going to cost $100 times the population. It won't cost that. So the second question still is, how do we fund the program? So we've run some just kind of back of the envelope estimates. And I think most cities and states should expect to pay around 0.1% of their budget. In Seattle, I believe it's less than that. It's like 0.06% of the budget, but I think 0.1% is a reasonable estimate. And what this shows is that funding democracy dollars isn't really a financial problem. If anything, it's just a political problem, right? You have to convince colleagues and voters that this is a good use of money. The argument that I would make is that democracy costs money, right? We spend money to mail people ballots, right? To print ballots. We spend money to host elections. And we say that that's okay because that's what it costs to have a free and fair democracy, right? To have elections that represent people. And this is just another example of that. But to get very specific, here are a few funding options. I'll go more in depth later on where democracy dollars have been proposed. But in Seattle, the program is funded by a property tax levy, which, as Esteban loves to emphasize, is the smallest increase in city history in property taxes, which benefited their campaign, being able to say that. When the program was proposed in 2016, statewide in Washington, it would have been funded by eliminating the non-resident sales tax exemption. In South Dakota, when it was proposed in 2016, the funding source was just an appropriation from the general fund. You can see here $9 per registered voter. So the point I'm making here is there's not necessarily one best funding source that will work for every city or every state. It's just important to find something that's politically palatable. So in Seattle, the property tax levy worked really well. Statewide in Washington, they chose the non-resident sales tax exemption. So it's just important to find what's going to work for your state. I've linked here, and I know in screen sharing, this isn't helpful, but we'll send out this presentation afterwards. I've linked here a report from the Center for Governmental Studies from a few years back, which details a ton of different funding options and might be helpful to go through as you start to look for how to fund this in your state. But it's just important to emphasize this is not a crazy expensive program. It might be helpful to find a specific funding source rather than just going to the general fund. But ultimately, you're looking at 0.1% of the state budget, so it's very doable. Continuing on here, kind of part two of the presentation here, I'm going to go into the results in Seattle. And again, some of this may repeat some of what we said at the first working group, but I'm hopefully going to go a little bit more in depth and share kind of how to think about this. So I think about the positive benefits in Seattle in three buckets. The first is the donors. So donors in Seattle are now more diverse, better represent the city. The second bucket is the candidates. And we've seen that more candidates can run competitively, candidates from diverse communities running competitively with democracy vouchers, even without support from wealthy donors. And the third bucket is kind of the less well-known one is how political culture has changed in the city of Seattle. And there are some great stats recently on how people, when they use their democracy vouchers, become more engaged with the system. So I'm going to take you through these donors, candidates, and political culture. First of all, the donors. Back before democracy vouchers, there was a study that looked at where money came from in Seattle politics. Around 1% of people were giving anything at all to local candidates. And most of that money was coming from wealthy white neighborhoods, particularly in homes that had views of Lake Washington or Puget Sound, right? So that just epitomizes that it was the wealthiest folks in the city who were donating. If you had a view home, that was one of the best predictors of whether or not you were likely to donate. So today, that's no longer true. Donors are more diverse by race, by income, by age, and also more geographically distributed throughout the city. So I have two quotes here. We had Professor Jen Herwig from Stony Brook University. She's partnered with Georgetown University as well on some of these studies, showing the coalition of voucher users contained a larger share of young, lower income contributors than cash donors. So more representative. Voucher users are still not fully representative of the electorate, but were more representative than cash donors. So this is substantial progress. Again, it's not a perfect representation of the electorate, as Professor Herwig emphasized when she spoke to the first working group. But it's substantially better than it was in Seattle. And I think this point emphasizes, or it drives home the importance of public outreach for democracy vouchers programs. So it's really important when passing this in your city or state to include as part of the legislation a requirement that whatever agency is administering it do lots of public outreach, right? Because what we don't want to have happen is just have the folks that are already most engaged be the only ones who know about democracy dollars and be the only ones who use it. And so Seattle's done a fairly good job of this, of holding events with communities in all parts of the city, of running ads to make sure that folks know about the program. And I think what we're seeing, this data is from 2019, which was better than 2017, the first time the program was used. I think what we're seeing is just that this is a brand new program. And so it was better right off the bat. Donors were more diverse right off the bat, and that's continued to improve each cycle. So hopefully once we have results from this last cycle in 2021, that trend will continue. So continuing on, candidates. More candidates have been able to run competitively and oftentimes win from all backgrounds, and even without rich backers. So I want to quickly go through 3 stories from the 3 election cycles that democracy vouchers have been used that kind of drive this point home. The first is from 2017. This is John Grant, who had run in 2015 before democracy vouchers, and then ran again in 2017 with democracy vouchers. He did not win his race. He narrowly lost, but he ran a very competitive campaign, fundraising to raising a lot of the money for his campaign from Seattle's homeless population. So John Grant has a background in tenant advocacy and homeless advocacy, which normally is not a very useful background for fundraising. And I think this kind of drives it home because this is a background that we want in our elected officials, right? We want elected officials who've worked on these issues. But in most places other than Seattle, it's not a useful background for running for office, right? When the parties go and recruit candidates, oftentimes the smartest strategy for them, as they see it, is to find folks with wealthy connections, right? Often folks who've worked in law or worked in business and who are going to be able to fundraise for their campaigns. And if we want elected officials that have worked in lots of different areas and have expertise on lots of different policy issues, democracy vouchers is a great step in that direction because it enables candidates like John Grant to fund their campaigns based on their connections to tenant unions and to the homeless population. And so I think this was, as far as I know, this was completely unprecedented in American history, raising such a large share of money from the homeless population. I don't know for a fact that that's never happened before, but I don't see how it could have before democracy vouchers. So continuing on, That's 2017. In 2019, there was a different sort of story. The Seattle City Council was debating a head tax, which would have affected some of the large corporations in Seattle, companies like Amazon and Microsoft with lots of employees. And the idea was they were going to tax some of these companies and use some of the money to fund homeless services. I'm not an expert on municipal tax policy, so I won't get into the specifics. But the gist is that the big companies didn't like it. And you can see headlines here before the election. Seattle's biggest corporations try to buy the council. So Amazon at this point had poured in $1.5 million into basically replacing most of the council was their goal. And this was a big question, right? You had kind of on one side candidates that were backed by Amazon and by Amazon's independent expenditures. And on the other side, you had candidates running with democracy vouchers, many of them being outspent. And the big question was, can democracy vouchers hold up and kind of withstand this onslaught? Would candidates be competitive? Would they be able to win? And the answer was yes. So here's the headline from after the election. Grassroots money beats Amazon in Seattle. Democracy dollars and an influx of small donations powered city council members to victory. And so there were seven of the 9 city council seats were on the ballot that year. And the results were 6 candidates who used democracy vouchers won their race. There was only 1 Amazon-backed candidate who won their race. So this doesn't mean that this will happen every time in the future, right? Certainly, politics continues. Independent expenditures aren't going anywhere. But the point is that with democracy vouchers, candidates can raise enough money to be competitive, even if they're still outspent. So the final story on candidates here is from 2021, when Seattle had the most diverse mayoral field in city history, and just elected the first person of color ever to be elected mayor, Bruce Harrell. And so I certainly won't claim that democracy vouchers are the only reason for this. That just would not be true. There are a lot of reasons that this was a more diverse field. There were a lot of reasons that Bruce Harrell won. But we can certainly say broadly that studies show that the typical campaign finance system hurts candidates of color and tends to benefit white candidates, particularly wealthy white candidates. And so more cities and states moving to democracy dollars like Seattle would on the whole benefit candidates of color. And we saw that in the results from the mayoral race, and even just in the candidates who ran in the mayoral race. So continuing on, that was donors and then candidates. And the third part I said I'd want to emphasize was political engagement. So again, this is kind of the hidden piece. I'll just take you through some of the statistics here because they're pretty shocking, I think. This, I guess maybe Esteban can speak to that, but I don't know if the reformers, when they initially passed democracy vouchers, expected these numbers. So I think it's very impressive. So just to take you through it, this is from 2019, comparing essentially voters who used their vouchers to voters who didn't. So among first-time eligible voters, if they used at least one voucher, they became 6 times more likely to vote. For folks who hadn't voted before, if they used at least one voucher, became 6.5 times more likely to vote. For low propensity voters, used one voucher, became 4.5 times more likely to vote. So substantial increases in voter engagement after using a democracy voucher. And what we think the reason why is that many of these people were previously just disengaged from politics, right? Many have never had their door knocked on before. Many have never spoken to a candidate or to someone working on a campaign before, right? We've all heard this, oh, all politicians are the same. They don't care about me. They're not interested in my community. But when someone comes to you and talks to you and asks for a democracy voucher, all of a sudden that calculus can start to change, right? And with democracy vouchers, what we've seen is candidates are incentivized to go everywhere, right? Previously, the most strategic choice for where to knock on doors would be, you call wealthy donors on the phone during call time, and then during get out to vote, you knock on the doors of likely supporters who are likely to vote. But now everyone in the city of Seattle is a potential $100 for your campaign. And so you're incentivized as a candidate or as campaign staff to go everywhere and to just knock on as many doors as possible, to engage in as many community events as possible. And so the result is that people are having their doors knocked on for the first time, right? And what we've seen is this causes cynicism to go down and political engagement to go up. I think this is really important to emphasize, because how often, we talk a lot about cynicism in politics. How often do you have a specific thing that you can do to lower cynicism, right? There are lots of levers that you can, dials that you can turn in government. You can change taxes, you can change government spending, but it's always kind of amorphous how that will affect political engagement. But here's a specific thing that we can do that we're seeing is lessening cynicism. So that's really powerful, and it's important to emphasize that when advocating for this. So going on here, and I have a few more slides left, and then we can do some Q&A. So I'm going to take you through some of the past efforts. So Democracy Dollars has been on the ballot 5 times. It's passed twice. So it passed, of course, in Seattle in 2015. In 2016, it passed in South Dakota. So of course, this was a presidential year. The presidential race was at the top of the ballot. Donald Trump won the state by 30 points. So this is not a blue state. But at the same time, voters approved Democracy Dollars. So what this drives home is that this is not just a progressive or a Democratic issue. This is something that all voters can get behind. The polling shows that too, that voters from both parties care about campaign finance, want a more representative government, want more people to be able to be involved. Now, the reason you haven't probably heard about South Dakota's Democracy Dollars program is that South Dakota is one of a few states where citizen initiatives are non-binding. And so the legislature promptly called an emergency session and repealed the initiative, despite the fact that it had passed with the support of the people. So they don't have a program. The initiative passed, but the program does not exist, which is obviously very undemocratic, but it does drive home the point that this can win in red states, in red areas too. It's not just a blue state thing. So the other 3 times Democracy Dollars have been on the ballot, it has not passed, although there have been some really close losses. It was on the ballot in Washington State, in Albuquerque, and then recently in Austin. And in a minute here, I'll go into some of the lessons from some of these campaigns and what we can take forward to do better. There are ongoing efforts in lots of places. So I mentioned that I'm the co-founder of one in Los Angeles, but there are other efforts. I've listed some here. I know that I've missed some, which is exciting that there's not room on the slide to list everywhere in the country where folks are trying to pass these policies. But you can see some of the ongoing efforts here. So lessons learned, and then we can go into Q&A. The first thing I would say is that positive framing is essential for Democracy Dollars and for good governance policies in general. The polling shows that Americans broadly care about campaign finance, but are very, very cynical about whether or not we will ever be able to solve it, right? So I think it was back in 2015, the New York Times did some polls on campaign finance, and the biggest divide between folks in the poll was whether they said that our campaign finance system, I think it was whether it needed fundamental change was one option, and like 40% of the people said that, or whether it needed to be completely rebuilt, and like 45% of the people said that. That was the main disagreement. So folks broadly agree that we need change. But when you talk to people about this issue, they don't really believe that change can happen. And so it's really important, talk about the problem, talk about why it's important, but quickly pivot to the solution and to the fact that we can fix this. So I have an example of something here that you could say, using some language from Rethink, and I know Kirsten's on this call, and they have some great language on what words are best to use. So this just says, right now, political rules unfairly favor the rich. We should create a real democracy where everyone's voice is heard, not just wealthy special interests. Democracy Dollars let everyone donate to campaigns so no one is excluded from the process. And so what's important about this is it emphasizes the positive solution, and it doesn't make government the enemy. right? When we make politicians or government the bad guy, that drives cynicism further, right? It's much better to make wealthy special interests the bad guy and to emphasize that we want a system where everyone's included. The final thing I'll say, which Esteban and the Seattle reformers always drive home, is that it's important, especially when passing this in a ballot measure, to include a sweetener, right? So that means packaging democracy dollars with other good governance reforms in an effort to paint a broader picture of what we want our government and our politics to look like. The thinking behind this is when folks aren't familiar, democracy dollars can be a little confusing. Some of the nuts and bolts, if you haven't used the system yourself, take some explaining. And so it's nice to have other things you can pair it with that paint a broader picture of what you're trying to do. So in Seattle, their sweetener was requiring signature gatherers to disclose whether they were paid, which worked really effectively. When you're talking to folks, sometimes you can lead with that and then go into democracy dollars once you have folks on board that your heart is in the right place with the campaign. In Los Angeles, we're discussing sweeteners as well. One idea is a policy banning foreign-owned corporations from spending money in elections. So that's related to campaign finance. It's tangentially related to democracy dollars. But the idea is by pairing them together, you can more easily paint a picture of here's the problem with campaign finance and here's the solution, right? Stopping foreign-owned corporations from spending and using democracy dollars to give more people a voice. And by pairing them together, it's that much more effective. So this is the end. I have real quick here. Just wanted to highlight some of the resources that the Democracy Policy Network has. This is our policy kit. Again, maybe someone can put the link in the chat, but this presentation will be sent out as well if you just want to click the link.
And then if you go to democracypolicy.network/democracy vouchers, it links to that as well.
Okay, perfect. So we have a shorter link. And then again, here is the link to the book. And we can include all of this. We'll include the slides and these links in a follow-up email as well. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and I think we're going to jump into some Q&A.
This is wonderful. So let's jump into Q&A. I also, you can drop questions in the chat. Let me see if there are questions that have appeared in the chat. And also, I want to see if Esteban, if you want to say anything as one of the original democracy voucher fighters in Seattle, if there's anything you want to add to what Tom said. Don't want to put you on the spot, though.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I will say I've really enjoyed hearing this and all the work that Deepan's been doing to spread the word. I've been blowing up the chat, which I apologize for. But I've been chiming in as we go, so I feel like I'm happy to weigh in more if folks have questions about Seattle. But I know Cindy's here as well, and would love to hear what other folks have to say.
Wonderful. And please read the comments in the chat. A lot of great clarifications and additions there. So we have a question from Kirsten. Are there tweaks that the Seattle folks would suggest given the results of 21 when it was 2 establishment candidates that emerged as the final 2 and there were huge sums spent throughout?
I can answer that, but Esteban or Cindy, do you want to jump in first?
Ranked choice voting would be nice to add to, because we have a top 2 primary, and that's a significant issue. If we had ranked choice voting, that might help.
Yeah, the one tweak, the tweak that comes to mind first is actually less related to the IE part of the question, but we've seen other efforts around the country that have emerged look at hybrid models, where in Albuquerque there was a conversation around potentially having a grant program. Once you qualify, you receive a grant, which would be a small grant enough to set up your campaign, and then you would collect vouchers after that, which I think is a really great approach, because then it allows campaigns to get off the ground and you can have the infrastructure to then do the next part more effectively. We didn't think of that in Seattle, and I actually wish that we had. In New Hampshire, they're kind of flipping it, where because there's it's a short period of time between the primary and the general, the proposal there has been to have vouchers or they call them voter dollars, where you collect them through the primary, and then if you make it through the primary, then you get a small grant at the end to carry you through to the general. I just like these hybrid ideas, and I think there's a lot more to explore there. So that's one thing that I wish we had thought of here.
Yeah, I would also add on independent expenditures, we're playing on an imperfect playing field, right? Because of Citizens United. So there's a limited amount that we can do to fix, right? So we can get creative with some of the ways we make life harder for independent expenditures, right? We can pass better coordination laws, better disclosure laws. But at a certain point, we need a constitutional amendment to fix all of these problems. And so democracy vouchers are the best thing that we can do right now, given we don't have that constitutional amendment or a new Supreme Court. But of course, I'm sure everyone on this call would love to overturn Citizens United.
I would add one tweak that I think we could make, and we'd have to think about this going forward. It's only a 10-year program, and it would be nice to see it more permanent. So we're going to have to address that when it comes up on the 10-year cycle, and then hopefully we can get voters to make it a permanent program.
I mean, do you think it's just because it was the first time it was the mayoral that the two kind of best known backed candidates were the ones that emerged? Do you think, 4 years from now, it might be different?
I think that's possible. I also think that this was never intended to be a silver bullet, or that it would suddenly make incumbents or well-funded establishment candidates suddenly non-competitive. I think at the end of the day, it's one part of the solution that we need to be thinking about and implementing, but it makes financial influence less of a factor, but it's not going to remove it completely, and I don't think it really can in this environment. So I think this is just one component. I think Cindy mentioned ranked choice voting. I think there are other ways that cities and states can try to address that, but I think it's also it definitely didn't make things worse, and it certainly changed how those candidates would run their campaigns. And they're also, they were well known, and so that's a pretty big hurdle for other candidates to be able to jump. I think we just needed. I think it's going to take some time, and we would likely see more candidates that understand how to use it, that might be able to have a little bit stronger pathway to be competitive there.
And there were also several less well-known candidates who raised a lot of money with democracy vouchers in the primary, right? Who raised like close to $500,000, I think, in a few cases. And they had very well-funded campaigns. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to win, right? If you're less well-known to begin with, you might still be at a disadvantage. But I think we can say that they had well-funded campaigns. They were able to get their message out, at least to a certain degree. And that wouldn't have been true without democracy vouchers. And so even if they didn't go on to win the mayoral race, we solved this one problem.
I also think that running a campaign isn't just about winning. It changes what policy platforms are being considered. It forces debate on areas that might otherwise be ignored. It inspires communities to turn out in different ways. And so I think all of that is really beneficial.
Yeah.
The
other thing that occurred to me too is in voters' minds, I have no research, there may be a difference between what people want in an executive and what you know what I mean? They might be willing to take a chance on like an unknown person for a legislative or a council race, but like what they want in an executive might be, somebody who's been on council for a while. So that definitely advantages. So I'm just, maybe a vouchers thing is more, it's better, and which you did, you tested it at council before moving to the mayoral.
We have a hand up from Adria.
Hey, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I wasn't, in the first session of this group, so perhaps this is something that was already discussed, but I was wondering if folks have thoughts on like the vouchers versus like matching program, like what they use in New York, because yeah, I'm just like curious to hear what folks think.
Yeah, so in Los Angeles, where I'm working on democracy vouchers, we have an existing matching funds program. So our whole goal, yeah, is to replace it with democracy vouchers. The biggest reason why, I think that matching funds are a positive step. So right now in LA, the contribution limit is $800, and the maximum matched amount is $114. And so what matching funds do is they take the political power from folks who can give 800 to folks who can give 114, right? Or folks who can give less than that. But what they don't do is they don't empower people who don't have any disposable income, or people who aren't predisposed to donate because they aren't engaged in that way. That's what only democracy vouchers do, is you don't need disposable income to use it. And if a candidate comes to your door, you might say yes, right? You might like the candidate and be willing to use it, even if you wouldn't be willing to part with $5, even knowing that it was going to get matched 6 to 1 or 8 to 1. It's much easier to part ways with your democracy voucher than it is to decide that you are the sort of person who spends money on political campaigns.
Yeah, and in Seattle, we considered a matching system. It was a 6 to 1 super match that we're looking at as well. And part of the reason we went with the democracy voucher program is because it felt like a more equitable solution by setting a floor for political voice that everyone can be at least a $100 donor, and then pairing that with lower contribution limits to $500 or $250 depending on the seat. Then all of a sudden you were shrinking that gap between the smallest and largest possible gifts. And so it felt like a more equitable solution. And right now, so until just a month and a half ago, I was working at the Piper Fund, which is a donor collaborative that was doing a lot of work and funding this kind of work. There's a grant to Jen and Brian, the researchers that Tom mentioned from Stony Brook and Georgetown, where they're actually doing a direct comparison between the two programs. And I know that some of that research is now starting to be released. And so more information on that should be available soon if it's not already out there, where they're actually doing a direct comparison and talking about outcomes.
One thing that might be useful to the group, when Lawrence Lessig, the Harvard Law School professor, was originally repopularizing democracy vouchers, he wasn't the one who originally came up with it, but he brought it back into he saved it from the obscurity of like a corner of a report at some point, and brought it to national prominence. He talked about this metaphor of, we want the donor election to look like the voter election. Because, and it was a really useful, sharp metaphor of, every candidate has to pass through a donor election that has about 2%, am I right, Tom and Estefana? About 2% of people that donate to campaigns. And even within that 2%, 75% of that 2% are the like $10 givers. And the real group is the ones giving the big stuff. And then they pass through a voter election, which is everyone. And it's like a ray, radiation that they pass through of getting rid of all the candidates that can't make it through the donor election. And then you have a much more fair voter election. And so he says the goal of a campaign finance system ideally would be to make the donor election look exactly like the voter election. And that's why he originally supported democracy vouchers, because it literally is spread even more democratically than a vote, because it includes non-voters as well. Whereas matching funds still kind of preserves the donor election, just supercharges it so it becomes a smaller portion of your time as a candidate. And so that's one way to think about these different systems.
Yeah, thanks. That's super helpful. I mean, I think I definitely in principle, I was I see the differences here. And so, yeah, I think it's exciting to hear that there's going to be research kind of comparing them, because I'm really curious about the uptake and what that looks like. Thanks.
Thanks. We got a question from Andre.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what type of talking points or fear-mongering messaging that they use against democracy dollars. I feel whenever you're raising a grassroots campaign, they have those talking points. What did you guys run into when advocating or trying to pass this in Seattle or whatever states you're working in?
I could say that in Seattle, there was a lot of talk about this being a solution in search of a problem, that this wasn't really an issue that we needed to deal with in Seattle. There's a lot of talk of welfare for politicians was another talking point. So we tried to get ahead of that by being able to talk about this as infrastructure, as like public investment in public infrastructure, and similar to having a sidewalk on the street that you might not like your neighbor, but they still get to use the sidewalk and drive down the road and go to school and have the fire department come to their house. That we need public infrastructure to be accessible, and this is electoral infrastructure. We need people to be able to participate in our elections, and so trying to use language around that. It also helped in Seattle that like a couple months before the election, there was a big scandal where a developer tried to essentially blackmail a candidate, actually the John Grant, because of his relationship to another organization. They threatened to take out an IE against him. And so that scandal sort of blew up and helped show people that there was a problem here. Those are some of the things that we ran up against those. That definitely the welfare for politicians, the idea that my tax dollars would go to somebody that I disagree with. It's even been the subject of lawsuits that so far have not held up. They've been dismissed, but people have definitely tried to sidetrack the program.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks care about fair elections, right? And have some distrust for politicians. And that's something that we can use to our benefit as reformers, but it's something that sometimes the other side tries to co-opt as well. The kind of the epitome of this was in California in the 1980s. There were two competing initiatives on the same ballot, one of which would have enacted a public financing program. It wasn't democracy dollars, but I think it was matching funds or something. And another initiative that would have banned public financing statewide. And both campaigns used similar language, right? One of them said, we can't trust these politicians because they're being funded by wealthy interests, so we need public financing to protect the people. And the other campaign said, we can't trust these politicians, and now they're trying to take public money to fund their campaigns, so we need to ban that. And both initiatives passed. Both measures were approved by a majority of the California electorate. And what, just to say what happened, the law in California is that if two competing initiatives pass, the one that gets more total votes becomes law. And so since the 1980s, public financing has been banned statewide in California because that one got more total votes, even though a majority of Californians also approved of creating a public financing system. So if you're in California, the way to overturn that would be with another statewide initiative. And I know there are folks working on that to try and get an initiative or referendum statewide. But the broader point is these messages can work for both sides. And so it's important that we take on the language of not having wealthy special interests have too much power, and that we show the hypocrisy and the falsehoods when the other side tries to adopt those same arguments.
We are at 4 minutes on the hour. We want to give time to give a special poll that's about to appear on your screen. It's going to ask you to choose one of three options. One, I am ready to champion democracy dollars this coming session or year, and I want to keep working with this working group and be reached out to see how we can help you champion. The other is you're not able to champion, but you want to keep in the loop. And the other is I'm not interested in staying in the loop on future work. So hope you can fill that out and hit submit. That'll help us know how much interest there is, and we will use that to directly reach out to you to help you out with this and get you more information. So thank you everyone for filling out that poll form of sorts. Any final questions? You can drop it in the chat. You could raise your hand. Seeing none, Tom, do you have any final words of what you want to share on this?
Thanks so much, everyone. Glad you're interested in working on this.
Thank you, everyone. It's so inspiring to see people from all across this country, red states and blue states, cities and states, West Coast, East Coast, and in the middle, This is a real exciting upsurge, and we here at the Democracy Policy Network, DEEPN for short, are here to help you make that happen and help you help each other in making that happen. Many thanks to Tom and to others on the call, Cindy and Estevan and others who have contributed to information to each other. We're going to keep this conversation going on the email list. Stay tuned for follow-up video of this presentation, what the slides were, other information. So appreciate you all. As always, you can reach out to us at democracypolicy.network. Thank you.